Located relatively close to a beautiful bay is the remarkable lost village of Tyneham in Dorset. In our videos we've looked at many medieval deserted villages, small hamlets that were abandoned hundreds of years ago due to the plague or a shift in farming methods. However, Tyneham is incredibly different. This lost village was victim to the Second World War and was forced to become abandoned due to history's most deadly conflict. But why was this? The majority of the fighting in the Second World War took place in Europe, and the Germans didn't invade British soil, so why was it left? Well, today we look at the remarkable story of Tyneham, the ghost village abandoned due to World War II. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Situated close to the spectacular Lulworth Cove and Durdle Door, Tyneham is an extremely interesting village. Firstly, access is only available when the Lulworth Ranges are open to the public and when the Ministry of Defence and British Army are not carrying out firing exercises or driving tanks across the local land. Evidence of occupation in this area dates back to the Roman times, and there were even small fishing communities set up here in the local area during the Iron Age. Tyneham was mentioned in the Domesday Book as Tyneham, meaning goat enclosure, and is surrounded by 7,500 acres of heathland. It's a place that has a long history of settlement, with the church being built in the 13th century. But why was it left abandoned? Today the ruins of the buildings are a constant reminder of the need to do anything it would take to see off a rather evil enemy, the enemy being the Nazis. You're probably thinking though, but how would this small village in Dorset help to lead to the downfall of Adolf Hitler and the German army? Even during the early stages of the conflict, this village would have operated as every village would have in England. It had its own church, a school for the young local children to learn in, several farms nearby, and also lots of cottages were found here. There was also a rather grand building known as Tyneham House, or the Great House, which was a rather ornate grand mansion. Life for the villagers was simple, peaceful and idyllic. There would have been very little running water, and even possibly no electricity, so it was rather cut off, but isolated in a way that allowed the villagers to gain peace. The local Worbarrow Bay would have possibly acted as a place for fishermen to launch their boats, cast their rods and gather in the evening meal. It would have been a lovely place to live, free from troubles in the outside world, but in 1943, this harmless and beautiful village would be changed forever. In November 1943, the villagers were given notice that they would be required to leave the village, their houses and their way of life within 28 days. This must have come at a huge shock to the people of Tyneham, basically being forced out of their homes. The whole area would be requisitioned on the orders of Winston, Churchill and the War Office in an incredibly quick but heartbreaking move for the people living there. The village had been occupied for centuries and the people were just left to do their own thing, but now it was being thrust into the largest and most devastating conflict that the world would ever see. The small isolated village would then be used by the British Army for training, and more particularly for preparations for D-Day and the vital invasion of Normandy, which would take place in June 1944 and would shift the tide of the war even further towards an Allied victory. Due to its close proximity to the Lulworth firing ranges, which were already being used heavily in training tank crews, the government decided to claim the village and much of the surrounding land as a place to train the Allied forces. Even still today, you have to check online to see if access to the village is allowed, because the army may be firing in the local area and access would be restricted. So for this reason, that their village and land was going to be used for the preparation for D-Day, the villagers were forced to leave within 28 days. They were notified by letter, and no indication of the reason why was given, leaving the villagers confused, but of course plans regarding D-Day were kept under complete secrecy. The letter would state, in order to give our troops the fullest opportunity to perfect their training in the use of modern weapons of war, the army must have an area of land particularly suited to their special needs, in which they can use live shells. For this reason, you will realise that the chosen area must be cleared of all civilians. It is regretted that in the national interests, it is necessary to move you from your homes, and everything possible will be done to help you, both by payment of compensation and by finding other accommodation for you if you are unable to do so yourself. The government appreciate that this is no small sacrifice which you are asked to make, but they are sure that you will give this further help towards winning the war with good heart. One villager would write on learning their fate, "It's nearly Christmas but there's little cheer as the last of the villagers leave. Many leave reluctantly, particularly the elderly, but with the enemy just across the channel, others are relieved." 225 people, most who had spent their whole lives living in Tyneham, some whose families had lived there for generations, were forced to leave. On the 17th of December 1943, the last resident of Tyneham left, believing that one day they would return. The last person leaving left a poignant note on the church door that said, "Please treat the church and houses with care. We have given up our homes where many have lived for generations to help win the war, to keep men free. We shall return one day, and thank you for treating this village kindly." During preparations for D-Day, the village sustained damage from nearby shelling and army manoeuvres. The villagers fully believed in the fact they would be returning back home following the end of the Second World War. They were initially promised that they could go back following the end of the conflict, but this was not meant to be. With the demands of the Cold War and the need for extensive training to continue of soldiers and tank crews, the land that encompassed Tyneham was kept for military use. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the army placed a compulsory purchase order on the land, and it has remained in use by the army ever since. But what happened to the villagers? Of course they'd be extremely annoyed with the fact they were not allowed to return home following the conflict. Campaigns were consistently launched to allow the villagers to return home. Demonstrations would take place, and the former inhabitants would even appeal to the National Trust to take the village as a National Heritage Site from the hands of the army. The situation would result in a stalemate, with the army infuriating protesters even more by dismantling the historic mansion of Tyneham House and using its stonework elsewhere after it was left in ruins. After years of no movement, the former residents and the army accepted and settled on an alternative, to allow greater access to the ghost village, with people being able to learn its fascinating story. This access would happen, as would the preservation of the village, with volunteers completing a fantastic job in restoring some of the buildings. However, the residents were still not allowed to inhabit their former homes, many now which had fallen into disrepair. After 50 years and 5 decades of struggle, the army agreed in the 1990s to allow limited access to Tyneham at the weekends, and it's now been expanded to whenever the range isn't firing. The final resident of Tyneham, Arthur Grant, a boy who was taught in the village school, would pass away in 2010. Poignantly, many of the old villagers who lived in Tyneham, including Arthur, are buried in the churchyard of the village, so in some respects they did manage to return to the village after all. Tyneham, however, is an incredibly fascinating place. It's a village frozen in time, forced to be sacrificed for the training of the army in preparation for one of history's most famous and vital invasions, D-Day. The overwhelming feeling here is one of sadness, and you can't help but envision the fear and trepidation that the villagers would have felt in late 1943 when they received the tragic letter ordering them to leave to help towards winning the war. The fact they were never allowed to continue their peaceful way of life does tend to leave a sour taste in the mouth. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Once again, thanks for watching.